Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mumey, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to episode 130 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson, and I'm really glad that you're with us. Thanks for spending some time as you're getting ready to study and prepare and hopefully pass your bar exam. Now, if you're listening to this episode close to our release date and you're taking the February 2017 exam, you're probably about 25 to 30 days until the test date. So there's a lot going on, we know, and I want to be really focused and really helpful with today's episode. This is part 4 of our special series on study strategies, and we're going to be looking today at something that's really near and dear to me. It's this idea of hacking your brain through the concept of spaced repetition. It's learning how to learn more in less time. So I hope you'll stick with me. I've got a lot of good information and I think pretty useful tips for you to use. Now, as I said, this is part 4 of our series on study strategies, and I just want to let you know, if you haven't been following us, that if you go back to episode 127, in that part, we started this series with part 1. We titled that, The House Always Wins. We're looking at the difficulty of using brute force on the test, of just sort of overpowering it by memorizing and reciting, and it's really relevant to what we're going to talk about today. You can find that episode and all of our podcast episodes on our website at celebrationbarreview.com. There's a link at the top of the page for podcasts. Click on that and you'll see all the episodes we've done as well as the show notes. You can also subscribe in iTunes or iHeartRadio and get all of the episodes delivered to your device automatically. In any event, that was episode 127. It was the first part of our series. In episode 128, we looked at part 2 of our study strategies, and we talked about the role that panic and anxiety play in studying and how divisive and difficult and harmful they are to you and how to overcome them. And I gave you some specific strategies to use. And if you're still feeling some anxiety and panic and you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you to do that. In last week's episode, I talked about 2 concepts that I think are really intertwined at this stage. One is called passion, and the other is vision. You have to have the bigger picture of what you're trying to do, but you also have to have the energy and the enthusiasm to make it through that last part of your studies. Now, today, we're going to continue our series on study strategies by looking at this idea of a brain hack. How do you learn more in less time? And that concept is called spaced repetition. Now, before I get into the details of talking about spaced repetition, and it's really near and dear to my heart, I want to invite all of you who are listening today, whether you're taking the exam in February or July of 2017, or maybe even later, love to have you join me this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern for a live 90-minute masterclass called How to Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. We're going to take a look at the 4 steps that you have to follow in order to pass the bar. And one of those steps will involve part of what I'm talking about today with spaced repetition. So it's really an opportunity to dive deeper on the material that we'll be talking about today. So I hope you'll join me for that. It's totally free, but you do need to register, and you can do that one of 2 ways. You can go to our website at celebrationbarreview.com, and right there on the page, you'll see a button. Just click on that and send us your email, and we'll get you registered right away. You can also text the phrase, all one word, of next bar exam. So next bar exam, text that phrase to the number 33444, and we'll register you using your mobile device. And for those of you who can't join us Thursday at 3, that would be 12 noon Pacific. If you can't join us at that time, we have an on-demand version of the same material, and you can register for that, again, by going to our website, celebrationbarreview.com. Just scroll down the page a little bit. You'll see the link for the on-demand version. It's the same information. You lose out on the magic of being live and having the ability to ask your questions in real time, but it's the same material and information, and we've got some great offers for you there as well. So I hope you'll join us one way or the other this Thursday or sooner or on your own schedule, but make sure that you check out that webinar, How to Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. Well, I want to talk about this idea today of spaced repetition, and you might be thinking, gee, I'm close to the exam, potentially. Is it too late for me to think about this? And the answer is no, and I'll get into that in some detail. Certainly less productive for you than it might be for someone that's taking the exam in July. So I really want to say to those of you who are taking your exams in July 2017 or later, this is critical to you. Please stay with me today. This is information that can really change your results in a major way, and you need to incorporate it as soon as possible into what you're doing. I want to take a deeper dive today on this idea of spaced repetition. It's a learning strategy, it's a learning philosophy that really is not new at all. It actually is called the mother of all learning, and there's a very clever Latin phrase, which I will not repeat for you because I never learned Latin. I can just tell you that it goes way, 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 way back. And so the idea of repetition being the mother of all learning is, I think, something that most of us accept at some intuitive level. But in terms of how repetition was used in a classroom setting, well, really, we can go back to the 1930s. That's where it first began to be asserted as a concept, as a teaching methodology, as a pedagogy. Now, I was very fortunate in the last 20 years or so to be part of a project called the Celebration School Project here in Celebration, Florida. This was a joint venture of the Walt Disney Corporation along with some of the leading educators from around the world, places like Project Zero at Harvard and Johns Hopkins, Auburn, Stetson, and other places, other universities. We came together to do what were called best practices in education, everything from pre-K, toddler, childhood development up through adult learning. And one of the concepts that we engaged and used with great success was the idea of spaced repetition. Now, when we started Celebration Bar Review, we transitioned and took that same idea of spaced repetition and we applied it to the way that we teach the bar exam to wonderful results. I mean, astounding results, really. Because what was happening was that we were learning how to hack the brain, to change the traditional method of cramming into something that was really quite different. Here's what typically happens to a bar taker, certainly at 30 days until the exam, but generally speaking in a traditional course. You get information, you read it or you hear a lecture, you read it consciously, word for word, line for line. Most likely you try to memorize the key points. And you might do a number of things to memorize. You might create flashcards. You might develop mnemonic devices to help you remember or memorize. You might even use different approaches where you think of different concepts in different rooms of a house. You handwrite it all out again in an outline, or you type it another time. There was one entire bar review course that was built on the idea that what you had to do was write out all your notes by longhand. Interesting concept. But the idea was always to grind that information into your brain. Unfortunately, the brain has this dilemma or this lack. Studies have consistently shown that we only remember 5 to 7 new pieces of information at a time. Now, that research has pretty widely been duplicated and replicated, and it has practical implications for how we have to learn. Because if you can only hold 5 to 7 ideas in your mind at any one time, I think you can see the inherent limitation of memorization. Still, that's what a lot of people try to do. And so you see the idea of a cram course or a cram course of study in which the idea is to simply get as much into your brain as you possibly can and then spit it out on the exam. Now, as I said in episode 127, when I talked about the fact that the house always wins, if you're trying to out-memorize the examiners, you're going to lose. They can test you on more information in every jurisdiction than you can memorize. It just is a simple fact. And so because of that, you simply cannot prepare by trying to memorize or learn everything. Well, that's a bit of a dilemma. If you can't memorize everything, if you can't cram everything, if you can't know everything, then what do? Well, you try to find the areas where you're going to have the most impact. That certainly makes sense. And you target your studying for certain information. And that's the purpose of a review course, is to target what you're learning so that it's not the entire body of knowledge, but it's what's most important for the exam. Unfortunately, most of the bar review companies in that space really believe that their view of the world is that they should be information providers. And I've used this analogy before, but bear with me because I think it bears repeating. Most bar review courses are like a Lowe's or a Home Depot. They're big, they're giant warehouses of information, and you can walk up and down the aisles and they'll drop information on you. And maybe all you really wanted to know was how to do a very simple, basic little project. You walked into that big home improvement store and you just needed to find one product or one tool or one skill. But here's row after row after row of information, mostly with people who are, they're working there, but really their job is just to tell you, go to aisle 7, right? Not very helpful to you in the long run. Now that's the typical approach to a bar review. What we've tried to do, I would describe as being more like Ace Hardware. It's more like the friendly, helpful hardware man, right? You come in and you say, look, Jackson, I've got this particular problem. I need a part. And I can show you where that part is, but more importantly, how to use it or how to put the project together and make it work. And spaced repetition is one of those skills, one of those tools that we employ because it makes a huge difference in your ability to retain information and to learn. So, with that background in mind, let me talk about how you hack your brain. Essentially, and I've put some links in our show notes today, I've tried to take some of the information that I think is a little more accessible and use that to dig into what is a fairly deep educational pedagogical approach. So bear with me here. But when we talk about hacking your brain, we know that an effective approach to learning has to essentially be developed with the brain's inherent limitations in mind. Now, there's the author James Gupta, who is the CEO of Synap, it's an online learning platform, wrote about this idea of spaced repetition, and I want to quote at a little bit of length from what he says about this idea of hacking your brain. And he says that any effective approach has to be developed with the brain's inherent limitations in mind. He says if we know that the brain cannot effectively store and recall lots of information in a short period of time, cramming is a recipe for disaster. Similarly, he goes on to say, we know that the brain preferentially stores information it deems to be important. In other words, it strengthens and consolidates memories of things that it encounters regularly and frequently. So spaced repetition, which is the revisiting of information regularly at set intervals over time, makes a lot of sense. He concludes that spaced repetition is simple but highly effective because it deliberately hacks the way your brain works. It forces learning to be effortful, and like muscles, the brain responds to that stimulus by strengthening the connections between nerve cells. By spacing the intervals out, you exercise these connections each time. It produces long-term, durable retention of knowledge, and in my experience, once people start using it, they swear by it, you'll learn more in less time. All right. Maybe I've got your attention, or at least your curiosity now. So what is this thing called spaced repetition? Well, very simply, what happens is that we have in our brains limited capacity in our conscious brains. And so in order to learn things, you need to be effective in retaining information over a longer period of time. But that won't happen in your conscious brain. It happens more often in your non-conscious or your genius brain. Research has shown that repeating something 20 times over the course of one day is less effective than repeating something 10 times over the course of a week. The reason for that is that the brain has to form a new synaptic structure and connections in order to consolidate it into long-term or non-conscious memory. All right, so spaced repetition is an approach as you're studying now for the bar that says instead of trying to memorize and cram, learn a little bit of information, let that process for a period of time, then repeat that information, then wait a period of time, then repeat that information again, repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Now, we take spaced repetition one step further by adding a step method to it. And what I mean by the step method is that not only do we repeat the same information, but we add a new small nugget of information that overlaps slightly. So think of it like a staircase going up in a house. We take the information, you repeat it, you delay a little bit, you add some new information and repeat the old information, delay, add some new information, repeat the old information, delay, and so on. This idea of spaced and stepped repetition is actually proven to be one of the most effective ways to study when it comes to the bar exam, and it's what I would encourage you to do. The way that that happens right now is to give yourself the opportunity to learn a concept and then give it a couple of days and come back to that concept and look at it again. Now, why is it so effective? A lot of reasons, but the one that I like best, the best explanation, has to do with something called the forgetting curve. And we've put a link in our notes to a really good explanation of the forgetting curve. But the forgetting curve essentially is a hypothesis about how much information we retain over a function of time. And the hypothesis of the forgetting curve is that most of us forget 90% of what we've learned within 3 days. I think, and if you're older, maybe even sooner. But in any event, this is why review within the first 24 hours of initially taking in the information is so important. Every time we recall and review the material, we forget less and less. And when studies have been done on this, we find that if you review material 24 hours, you retain 80% of the information. But again, if you don't recall the material, you'll soon forget it, even though it's not at quite as fast a rate. But then if we recall the information a third time within 48 hours, we would retain approximately 85% of the information. And if we review again on the third day, we retain almost all the information that was initially learned. So what happens is that we forget at a much slower rate after recalling the material 3 more times after learning the information. So that's the beauty of spaced repetition. Every time you recall the information, it's further ingrained into your long-term memory. And once it's ingrained there, what happens is the brain starts to consolidate that information into chunks. And when you've got chunks, then you've got the bigger picture, and the understanding of different concepts and your ability to use them become much greater. And we've talked about that when we talk about knowing and learning rather than reciting. Okay, so the idea here is that you take a body of material, you work on it, and then you set it aside for a day or two, and then you come back to it in a day or two. Now, with 30 days left to the exam, you don't have a lot of days in between to be able to work. So the truth is that it's effective, though maybe not as effective as if you had more time. I will say this, that most research today says that to create enough closely associated repetitions to drive a newly strengthened skill into the subconscious or automatic mode, skill training should be delivered over multiple days a week and at least over a 3-month period. So, if you're taking the exam in July of 2017, guess what? You need to start now to get the most impact out of spaced repetition. But for those of you taking the exam in a month, you can still get an enormous impact even though you don't get the 3-month period. What will happen is that the information won't be driven as deeply into the subconscious, but it will be there for you, and you'll have better retention and control of that information than if you were simply cramming for the next 30 days. So I think this is really an important piece of sort of practical information that you can take with you. So how should you do spaced repetition? If you're studying in our course, it's built into the course. You've done some reading or photo reading, and then we ask you to wait a day, and then we repeat that information through the use of a lecture. Then you wait a day, and we repeat the information again through the use of practice questions, whether they're essays or multiple choice. Then we wait a few more days, and we come back. So notice what happened there. You've had 3 repetitions. You understand the connection. Now we wait a few more days and we come back and we have you photo read again or read again and do more questions in that same subject. So now we're adding a little bit. We're stepping it and we're spacing the repetition. And we space that repetition out in longer and longer intervals because the studies show consistently that the more interval time you have as you get further iterations, the better the results. So if you had perfect timing, if you could study now for July, you could see the looping effect of having more time. But without having those extra days, essentially what you're doing is compressing the repetition, and that's still more effective than if you were trying to memorize. So here's some specific suggestions. If you're not in our course, what would you do? Well, I think first is that within 24 hours of taking in new information, go back over the notes that you took. Try to recall important points. And there's a difference between rereading and recalling. And so rereading doesn't do as much for you. If you're not a photo reader, it doesn't do much at all. And so really it's a matter of trying to recall rather than read. Then, within a day after that first review, go back and try to recall the information again, either by doing questions of some sort, or perhaps listening or watching a lecture, or writing down some notes for yourself. Again, this is for those of you that are not in our course and don't have the repetition built in. And then, after that, every 24 to 36 hours for the next several days, try to quickly recall the material. This doesn't have to be a lengthy recall. It's simply a recall of material that you're just going back over in your mind and taking a 15-minute to 45-minute study period of time to recall that information. When you can recall it in a quiz or a test format, like doing practice questions, that's a best way that we've found to recall the information. Then, in the final run-up to your exam, typically 7 to 10 days before the exam, go ahead and take the material out, begin recalling it and studying it again, and the idea is to reconsolidate the information in order to give your brain the time that it needs to reprocess the concepts. So, that's a pretty simple approach to working all the way through. Now, some of you have flashcards, not in our course, but some of you have flashcards, and you might say, well, I'm using my flashcards to memorize. Is that the same thing? Not really. I would say if you're using flashcards in that situation, what you should do is find the flashcards that you're good at, and once you've answered a question correctly, put it in a different pile and look at it less frequently. The ones that you're having more trouble with, go back over those repeatedly. I think the same thing is true, certainly in our course where we're not using flashcards because we don't think you should memorize. But where you're working through questions, the questions that are giving you the most difficulty, I would set those aside and look at them more often. The questions you're getting correct, I don't think you need to go back and look at quite so often. So the idea here is to really use different strategies in order to give your brain the opportunity for the most amount of spaced repetition. Now, if you think about this brain hack, it really makes sense that your brain is going to retain information more effectively. When it gets it, it has a chance to process it and then use it again. So it's the use of the information that drives it into the non-conscious. Think about a child learning a new skill like riding a bike. If you're anything like me or my children, it didn't come in one fell swoop. Sometimes it does, but generally it's pretty tough to do that. What you have to do is to make those skills a stored routine. And to do that, you first have to consciously think about it. You got to know what you're not able to do, and then you learn how to do those things. I got to keep my balance, I got to keep my feet on the pedals, and so on. But once you begin to develop the skill, then you don't have to consciously think about your participation in that. It becomes a non-conscious activity. I've told my students it's a little bit like learning to drive a car. At first it's very complicated, and then it becomes an automatic activity. Why? Because we repeat it over and over and over again, and the brain reinforces the particular skills that are necessary in order to do that. The same thing with learning to ride a bike. After a while, if you watch a child ride a bike, they don't really have to stop and think about how they're going to stay upright or balance. They're just able to keep going without falling off. And every time the child rides the bike, then that skill is going to be reinforced. Thus, when people go on to say it's like riding a bike, years later I come back and I know how to ride a bike. How is that possible? Well, it's the power of repetition. It's so encoded in our brains that we can ride a bike even if we haven't been on one in many, many years. So there is real power in this approach and in this idea of repetition. And I want to encourage you to employ it for the next 30 days, certainly if you're taking the exam in February. Keep repeating in small chunks. Even though you don't have big gaps of time, it will be more effective than if you simply took the information and you just kept repeating and repeating and repeating it, or trying to memorize it or trying to work from your flashcards. If you're taking the exam later, this is the time to begin your studies, because now the repetition loop cycle can be longer, which makes it more effective. And that's why it's important, in fact, we would say critical, to start early when you're getting ready for your bar exam. If you're in our course, we've already built most of this in, as I say, and so you don't have to do a whole lot more. It's already built into the DNA of what you're doing. But if you're studying on your own or you're using one of the big box bar reviews, you might have to hack the system a little bit to make it work for you, but I can promise you that the results are well worth it. And so instead of spending your time now trying to memorize and recite, spend your time trying to work through this spaced repetition. And I think what you're going to discover is that you can learn more in less time. Well, that's our episode for today. I hope that it's been helpful to you. I hope that these study strategies have been a useful series. We're going to continue on next week with part 5 of our study strategies series. We'll be looking again at some of the study strategies you want to employ right at the end of your study if you're coming up on the exam. So I hope you'll stick around for that. And as always, we'd love to have you subscribe to this podcast series. You can do that by going to iTunes or iHeartRadio. We'd also love your honest rating and review there. It lets people know about this podcast series. We've been really very grateful for the incredible support and the growth of this podcast over the past year and a half. So thank you all so much for that. I hope everybody has a great study week. I hope that this is a productive week for everyone, that you get the opportunity to take advantage of these new skills in spaced and stepped learning. And we'll see you again next week on our next episode of the Extra Mile Podcast. Until then, see you on the pass list.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile Podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.